The Ford government has unveiled its election budget. The financial blueprint is loaded with billions of dollars in hospital, highway, and transit investments. The document is set to serve as the progressive conservative platform during a campaign expected to kick off next week. It has the party projecting Ontario will be nearly $20 billion in the red this year, a bigger deficit than the province ran in the first year of the pandemic. Now, here are some of the budget highlights, the big ticket items to remember. It is a $198.6 billion spending plan with a deficit projection of $19.9 billion. A new tax credit for middle and low-income seniors for medical care at home, expanded lower-income individuals and family tax credit. Individual eligibility expanded from those earning $35,500 a year to $50,000. $25 billion for highway planning and construction over the next decade. Lots of infrastructure re-announcements on hospitals. The license plate sticker rebate will cost $1.8 billion, $800 million more than first thought. The temporary fuel and tax cut will cost Ontario $645 million in lost revenue this year.
We're getting things done. We're building things. We have a plan that's very clear that I tabled in the budget to rebuild Ontario's economy. Get those bigger paychecks, build infrastructure. We're building those subways. We're building highways, getting people out of gridlock, and we're definitely supporting workers.
NDP leader Andrea Horwath says the new low-income tax break won't provide enough financial relief for workers.
They're not telling you the whole picture here. Absolutely, lower income folks need a break, but let's face it, Doug Ford took $6,000 out of minimum wage workers' pockets, and now he's going to put $300 back, maybe, depending on where you are on that scale of income, because it's diminishing. The higher income you are, as you get closer to $50,000, it could be just literally a couple of cents in your pockets. But even if it's $300, he took $6,000 out, $3,000 back in. I guess it's welcome, but boy, he certainly has hurt people in his choices around cutting the minimum wage.
Meanwhile, Ontario Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca is describing the budget as disappointing.
On the housing front, we've seen over 4 years, 3 or 4 now, housing plans from Doug Ford and his team. I look at his latest version of a housing plan, nothing for renters, nothing for first-time home buyers, nothing for student housing, and the list goes on from there.
So let's break it down. Joining us live tonight with their reaction to the Ontario budget, Kate Harrison, Vice Chair of Summa Strategies Canada, who's representing the Progressive Conservatives, Shanice Scott, Account Director at Hill and Knowlton Strategies, who's representing the Liberals, and Clement Nocos, Director of Policy and Stakeholder Relations at the Broadbent Institute, who's representing the NDP. Kate, let's start with you. Lots of talk about building an infrastructure. We've seen the Premier already crisscrossing the province touting hospital announcements, but what about staffing? Where's the investment in training new doctors, nurses as well, and care aides? That takes a lot of time.
Yeah, well, it's a good point, Scott, and there are a number of measures in the budget that are designed to do exactly that, recruit and retain nurses in particular, some benefits as well for personal support workers. Obviously, those were two major outcomes of the pandemic, the need to better resource and staff the healthcare system, and the Ford government has responded. And I think that responsiveness really is the key word coming out of this budget. It is really an attempt to speak to everyday Ontarians about the things that they care about the most, and that is getting moving, getting out of gridlock, and of course, rebuilding. That includes the healthcare system. It also includes housing and really importantly, transit, highways, but also public transit, major investments there to the tune of $65 billion. So I think that this budget aligns really well with what Ontario voters are talking about today, their concerns coming out of the pandemic. And I think that it'll resonate with voters on the campaign trail.
A lot of hospitals are talking about the staffing shortage now. What can be done to fix that immediately?
Well, certainly this credit can help support the future workforce. There are incentives in there as well to retain existing nurses. I believe that there was also a pay increase that was touted before the budget that may have been elaborated on within. So there's certainly work to be done, and there remains a lot of challenges, Scott, in terms of making sure that doctors are spread out across the province, not just concentrated in city centers. Rural healthcare remains a challenge. So it's obviously a work in progress, but I do think that there's some incentives in there with dollar figures attached to them, importantly, that will help get more people into healthcare and into that workforce.
Clement, there's an expansion of a tax credit for low-income families. Of course, the license plate sticker rebate, a new tax credit for middle and low-income seniors for medical care at home. These are real dollars back in people's pockets when inflation is, of course, hurting all of us. Is there enough in this budget, in your opinion, to tackle affordability right now?
There simply isn't. For me, what is presented in the budget isn't necessarily surprising, or it's not surprising to budget watchers, because there isn't really anything new here. It looks to me more like a laundry list of what the Doug Ford government has done in Ontario these past 4 years. And if today's budget is more like an election platform announcement talking about affordability, it's not a real piece of legislation that we have budgets normally be, then I would be surprised to see new ideas put out in this election platform / budget. It's too focused on cuts to education, despite what students and education workers have faced throughout the pandemic. So if we're talking about putting money back in pockets, they're taking that out in cuts to education. We're talking about there's in this budget talk about new hospital beds, new long-term beds for for-profit homes, but there isn't this major investment in experienced healthcare staff leaving. We see an incentive, but it's simply not enough. It amounts to something like a few dollars added to wages when we need to see an increase in wages for healthcare workers if we're expecting them to stay on the job. I think this isn't doing enough. For affordability, we can see that there might be a cut in healthcare. You get that back in your sticker for your license plate, but at the end of the day, our healthcare system suffers. I just don't think it does enough for Ontarians.
Shanice, from your perspective, how important is it for the Liberal leader to differentiate his plan to this budget? Polling has shown the party is within striking distance, but many voters are still unfamiliar with Stephen Del Duca.
Yeah, I think it's very important for Stephen Del Duca to position himself as a contrast to Doug Ford, and that's someone who genuinely cares about Ontarians and families and building them up. Stephen has always consistently pointed out that he cares about investments in education and investments in our long-term care sector. Of the policies we've seen the Liberal Party put out already they're investing more than the NDP are in elder care. We've consistently been pushing for more for education. I think Stephen has a clear path and there's a clear choice for Ontarians. Do you want someone who's going to invest in your family, in your health, in your life, or do you want someone who's just going to cut it and give you kind of cheap sticker items like the license plate rebate?
Okay, very little was said about housing in this budget. The headline, 1.5 million homes over 10 years, but this isn't new. We've heard this. We've heard this for weeks. What type of housing, where, and for whom? I think that's important for the voters to know.
Yeah, well, the housing plan, to your point, Scott, was tabled a number of weeks ago, and I think that the goal there is to obviously socialize it as much as possible in advance of the budget and the campaign, so that there's lots of times for voters to consider the pretty ambitious plan that the Doug Ford government has put forward on housing. Certainly, the biggest issue remains supply, and working directly with municipalities and others to make sure that supply issues are addressed. There's the elimination of red tape where possible to build as many houses as possible. That's going to be really key. The other thing that I think is important when we're talking about housing is the infrastructure that supports it, and that's also public transit. And this government has made billions of dollars in investment in the public transit system, and that is designed, of course, to make sure that as many people can get into the city centers back and work to home as possible. So this is a government that's considering, yes, the supply issue, but also the things that go around that, including public housing and, of course, the major investments around rebuilding highways, extension of highways to make sure that people are able to get from A to B as fast as possible and spend more time with family.
Clement, in Andrea Horvath's response, she said, quote, "There was an opportunity to address things COVID has shown us were broken. How will the NDP fix what COVID has exposed?"
And look, COVID has exposed, quite frankly, the mental health crisis that Ontarians are facing. And, it was a missed opportunity for Doug Ford, I think, to present the change that Ontarians can't wait for any longer on mental health. For me personally, I would have loved to have seen something like a proposal on mental health care, like what the Nova Scotia PCs did in last year's election, where they proposed a universal mental health care plan. And our latest research at the Broadband Institute shows that Ontarians are facing declining trends in mental health, that the pandemic has only accelerated. So we only see that there are paltry appeals to taking care of mental health for frontline workers, but we're not seeing a real policy to address the gap in mental health care in our healthcare system that the pandemic made apparent. The pandemic made mental health worse, and we don't still see the healthcare in this budget to address that gap. And I would have liked to see that with the opportunity to make sure that Ontarians get the help they need.
Now, Shanice, if the Ford government's headline for this budget is Ontario's plan to build, what do you think the Liberal headline should be in order to gain ground?
I think the Liberals' headline will be, it's a clear choice for Ontarians. There's a clear path. The Liberals' brand has always been, we are investing in Ontarians. Doug Ford has recently announced an increase in minimum wage, but that is a plan he killed. If the Liberals had been reelected in 2018, that is something we would have had for Ontarians. We would have invested that into our people in Ontario. So I do think right now it's a clear choice. And the Liberal plan, as it comes out more, we will see that choice.
Well, we have to leave it there. The election now 5 weeks away. Kate Harrison, Shanice Scott, and Clement Nocos, thanks so much for joining us tonight.